All right. So we're going to be in First Peter chapter 2, starting in verse 11, and we're actually going to cover a pretty expansive space. We're going to go through chapter 3, verse 7. And so I'm going to kind of read different portions and then talk about it and things like that. And so you just kind of follow along and we'll make it. So as I said, this is going to be some tough scriptural stuff. And honestly, there's things that I'm still kind of working out in my mind as well. It's like, how far do you take that? What does that really mean? I also want to say this is a soapbox warning. There's so many different things that you could get on a soapbox here or there. There's some trigger warning stuff in here for sure. But one of the things that we've been trying to do is trying to set up the context of 1 Peter. And it is so important that we understand the context of all of it so that we don't misunderstand a few verses here. Because some of these verses have been used to perpetuate evil in the world, right? And it frustrates me to no end because I think many times it's people who are wanting to do damage to the Bible, to do damage to the Christian faith, that will pull verses out, completely out of context, and claim that they say things that they completely don't. And then also, sometimes Christians trying to follow the Bible literally will read things out of context and do things that's not really what the Bible was saying, right? This is full of those things. And so again, First Peter, Peter is writing to a large group of Christians at many different churches, many different communities throughout the Roman Empire. Most of them are starting to endure some persecution. There's not a whole lot that are being killed at this point, but it's starting to be very difficult for them. They're starting to wonder, hey, how do we live as Christians in this society that doesn't accept what we do, right? And a society that kind of mocks what we're trying to do, and then many times is hostile towards how we're trying to live, right? So that's what Peter has been doing this whole time. And so now he gets to this point where his main emphasis here is, okay, how do you live your life in a society that goes against your beliefs? Now, one thing that we have to be really careful of is sometimes we blur that and we start thinking, oh, well, maybe our society does accept the way that Christians should live. Well, overall, no, right? There is a difference. There's a worldly point of view and there is a godly point of view. And many times those are in conflict, right? It doesn't mean that they don't match up in certain areas. They do. But a lot of times the perspective that the world says you should have is based on something totally different than the perspective that God says we should have, right? And so what Peter is writing applies today just as it did back then, right? And so I want to just start off, and I've said this before, one of the things that happens in our Bibles now is that we've added little, subheadings, and we've added chapters and verses, understandably, so that you could kind of have a way to do it. Many times that messes up the way that we read the letter. And this is one of those cases. That's why we're starting in chapter 2 and we're going all the way through chapter 3, because this is all one thought. Peter did not write and then take a break and go, okay, now chapter 3, now I continue, right? No, this is all one thought. So here's the main point of this whole section of Scripture. Chapter 2, starting in verse 11. Dear friends, I urge you as foreigners and exiles to abstain from sinful desires which wage war against your soul. Live such good lives among the pagans that, though they accuse you of doing wrong, they may see your good deeds and glorify God on the day he visits us. All right, stop right there. That really is the whole point of everything else that is going to be said, okay? This is a pretty simple idea. It's very difficult to do, right? What it's acknowledging is that, hey, we live in a secular society. We read that term pagan now, and we think of, people putting on horns and dancing around, a 5-star or something like that. No, that is a secular worldview, right? Doesn't mean there's not spirituality connected to it. The Romans were very spiritual. They believed in all kinds of gods. But this is a secular view of the world. So what Peter is saying, okay, so as you live in this world, right, you should live a good life, abstain from sinful stuff, right? Abstain from that because it does damage to your own soul, but it also hurts what you're trying to do in the world. You're trying to bring the message of hope to the world around you. And so the way that you live is important. So you should live in the way that God has called you to, knowing that that is going to be opposite the way the world wants you to live. And it's going to cause tension, and it's going to cause problems, right? But he's saying you should do it. This is something, he's not saying you should do it. It's nearly, if you've decided to follow Christ, this is what it means, right? And so it's time to choose. Are you going to just say you believe in something, or are you going to actually start living that out? So that's the whole point of the rest of this, is that we live in a secular society, and we need to live godly lives in the midst of that, right? And one of the things that is so important to recognize here is that the world has been full of sin for a long time. There have been sinful practices, sinful institutions, sinful ways of looking at things from the beginning, right? And it's interesting, and this is important, because sometimes I think we're in this place right now, and especially you see it politically, because each political side has to convince you how bad things are so that you will vote for them so that they can fix it, right? So everybody's like, oh, this is so horrible, and you nearly get this feeling that people think that things are worse now than they've ever been before, and that there's more, more sin and things like that than there ever has been before. No, we're going to talk. Peter, basically what he's done is he says, okay, you need to live godly lives in the midst of a secular society. And now he goes, here's 3 examples. Here's 3 bad examples of what society does and how you need to live in the midst of that. So all of these examples are, in a sense, negative examples. He's saying, okay, here's how society views things, which is obviously wrong. The people reading this would have been like, yeah, it stinks to be living in this time right now because this is the circumstances that we're in, right? And he's saying, this is the way that it is, but you have to choose to live differently, right? And so the first one is dealing with governments, dealing with authority. So this is a negative thing that he is describing. This is the secular way that the government is working. So starting in verse 13, it says, submit yourselves for the Lord's sake to every human authority, whether to the emperor as to the supreme authority or to the governors who are sent by him to punish those who do wrong and to commend those who do right. For it is God's will that by doing good you should silence the ignorant talk of foolish people. Live as free people, but do not use your freedom as a cover-up for evil. Live as God's slaves. Show proper respect to everyone. Love the family of believers. Fear God. Honor the emperor. All right, let's stop right there. A couple things that especially we as Americans aren't going to like, right? We fought a war in starting in 1775, 1776 was officially declared, said, you know what, this government is too ungodly and is restricting our freedoms, and we're going to fight it, okay? You read that, and you're like, oh, wait, what's that saying? I struggle with this part. I still believe that there are times that you stand up and that you throw off evil systems, all right? That, I believe you can find that biblically, all right? That is not Peter's purpose here. He's not making a case for revolution or to change a system. He is saying, listen, you live in a pagan society, secular society. You have to choose how you're going to live within that. Even in a revolution setting, you have to live your day-to-day life. That's what he's talking about here. And so the people find themselves under a system that is not freedom-loving, that oppresses many people much more than we can even imagine, right? These people are oppressed by their government. They literally live on the whims of an emperor. And the emperor, and there were some crazy ones, can change any law at any point that makes your life illegal, right? I mean, it was a very interesting system, a very difficult system, not fair, not just in any way. And so what Peter is saying is he's acknowledging this is not a good system. This is a secular viewpoint. But you have to choose how you're going to live in the midst of that, right? And he says, for it is God's will that by doing good, you should silence the ignorant talk of foolish people. Live as free people. Isn't that interesting? The people were not free. They were by no means free. But he says, live that way, right? Live in a good way that starts to share the gospel message with the world around you. You can't control what government you're under. You can control how you live under that government, right? And you should choose to live a godly life, even though people who are ungodly have authority over you. That's a hard thing. We have to acknowledge, man, that's not easy. And again, this doesn't mean that there's not ever a time that we can rebel against that. But in our day-to-day lives, you're going to find yourself living in circumstances that are not fair and are not just. But you have to choose to live good lives, right? To live positive lives, to live lives the way God calls us to live, even in the midst of that. All right, so we continue on. This is, so that's example number one. Government systems that are unjust and unfair. You've got to choose how you're going to live in the midst of that, right? And you should choose to live a godly way. Then he gives another example. Again, these are negative examples. This is one of the ones that irritates me the most. There are people that will try to claim that the Bible condones slavery, right? It is the most asinine thing in the world. Now, if you take one verse and just put it on a poster somewhere, you can go, oh, maybe the Bible condones slavery. No, that is not the case. This is a negative example. Also, this shows us that slavery is not a unique sin. In fact, the existence of slavery to me proves that sinfulness is throughout the world and throughout the history of the world, right? This is a hot button topic right now. We talk about it a lot, and many of us, we talk about that it is the original sin of America, right? That slavery is. That's kind of a phrase that we hear. And you know what? It is a horrible sin of America. Guess what? It's the sin of every country that's ever existed in the world. If you want to go find and live in a country that the original sin wasn't slavery, good luck and go to Mars. As far as I know, there hadn't been slavery there yet. If we get there, there will be, because it is a sinful part of our nature, right? And this is just, sorry, this is my soapbox. All right, so we think of it, and we're so isolated, and I don't do this to justify anything, obviously. It's just to understand that this was a pervasive thing throughout the world, right? Did you know that from the slaves that came from Africa that crossed the Atlantic, right, so came that way, that only 5% of those slaves actually came to the United States? Of the 95% of the others went to South America, to the Caribbean, to all over. Like Brazil, 35% of the slaves from Africa that came west went to Brazil, right? It was evil for all of it. But we're not unique in it. It was something that infects the entire world, right? And it is a horrible thing. And it's something that we continue because, by the way, there is still slavery in places. And we sometimes seem to be more concerned about the fact that we had slavery 150 years ago than the fact that there's still slavery in the world today, right? But people have chosen to discredit the Bible, to discredit faith by using passages like this to say, oh, maybe the Bible condones slavery. No, slavery was evil. It was evil then, but guess what? The people that Peter is writing to, they weren't going to end slavery that year. It wasn't going to happen. It was pervasive. And the way that they were going to go about changing the perspective on slavery was to live a different way in the face of it. And that's what Peter talks about in verse 18. Slaves, in reverent fear of God, submit yourself to your masters, not only to those who are good and considerate, but also to those who are harsh. Now listen to this. It says, for it is commendable if someone bears up under the pain of unjust suffering because they are conscious of God. It says right there, if someone bears up under the pain of unjust suffering, he is saying, I know this is unjust. What you're going through is unjust suffering. And guess what? It sucks. It's not fair. But this is you are in this secular system, this secular mindset. And so you can choose to just wither up and die, or you can choose to take control of the situation and live differently in light of that. And that's what he's saying. He says, but how is it to your credit if you receive a beating for doing wrong and endure it? But if you suffer for doing good and endure it, this is commendable before God. To this you were called because Christ suffered for you, leaving you as an example that you should follow in his steps. He committed no sin and no deceit was found in his mouth. This, again, talking about Christ, talking about what he went through, right? When they hurled their insults at him, he did not retaliate. When he suffered, he made no threats. Instead, he entrusted himself to him who judges justly. He himself bore our sins in his body on the cross so that we might die to sins and live for righteousness. By his wounds we have been healed. For you were like sheep who have gone astray, but now you have returned to the shepherd and overseer of your souls. All right? What is he saying? He's saying you are in an unjust situation. You are going to be treated unfairly. But you know what? You can choose to do good in the face of that. That is exactly what like Martin Luther King Jr. did. Right? It's like, hey, we're in an unjust situation, but we are going to act good. We are going to be better. Right? We're going to be better than those who are oppressing us. And guess what? It changed a system. It would eventually change this system too. Right? But I think it is so clear, and I just want you to be very clear that this is not condoning of this practice of slavery. It was talking about how do we live when we are living in unjust situations. We can't just snap our fingers and change all of that. Right? And again, this isn't there aren't times to stand up and fight against evil structures. Right? That should be done, but it can still be done in a godly way. Right? So then he goes on. We're just throwing all the hot button topics out right now that tick everybody off. And it's important because Peter understands that. And again, he is saying these are bad things back then. Right? So now he's talked about governmental injustice. He's talked about slavery. Now he's going to talk about sexism. What? There was sexism? I thought we were the sexist country in the world. We're pretty sexist because sexism has existed from the beginning of time. Right? That's why it is an inherent part of evil in the world around us. It's something that we have to constantly battle and constantly try to be better and move forward. It is important to recognize that. You know, it's funny because the Women's World Cup is going on right now and is getting all kinds of ratings. It's great because our women are awesome, right? And but there's been some things that they were criticized because of some of their celebrations, right? Which, by the way, if you watch sports, celebrations are criticized all the time, right? Like Cam Newton, who is a quarterback for the Carolina Panthers, got criticized every time he celebrated by people. And so there were some criticism. That's what sports is, right? We nitpick on things that don't matter, right? Well, that was fine. I thought it was kind of funny. It was kind of a neat thing. Well, then there were some people that wrote articles. This is an example of that we are still sexist and sexism still exists. You're like, well, okay, all right, maybe so. For some people, yes. But is that really what sexism is? And it's like, the women in Iran weren't allowed to go watch the men play soccer until last year. That may be a little more sexist. But again, all of this shows sexism is still around. It was around then. And so now Peter is using a system that was in place, that was culturally in place, that was not fair to women. And he's saying, but you've got to choose how you are going to live in that unjust situation. So he says, wives, and this is where it messes up. We see this big chapter 3. It's like, oh, he must have wanted to start this. No, this is just the third example of bad examples of how you try to live in an unjust society, right? It says, wives, in the same way, submit yourselves to your own husbands, so that if any of them do not believe the word, they may be won over without words by the behavior of their wives, when they see the purity and reverence of your lives. Your beauty should not come from outward adornment, such as elaborate hairstyles, wearing of gold jewelry, and fine clothes. If you notice, it didn't say don't wear those. It says your beauty shouldn't come from that. That's something we talk about all the time now. That your beauty doesn't come from what you wear or what you look like. It's what's on the inside. And people will use that as, see how the Bible represses women and doesn't, it's garbage. Rather, it should be that of your inner self, the unfading beauty of a gentle and quiet spirit, which is of great worth in God's sight. For this is the way of the holy women of the past who put their hope in God, used to adorn themselves. They submitted themselves to their own husband, like Sarah, who obeyed Abraham, called him her Lord. You are her daughters if you do what is right and do not give way to fear. Husbands, in the same way, be considerate as you live with your wives. Treat them with respect as the weaker partner. That's actually talking about strength, because physical strength was very important. They acknowledged there's a difference between physical strength between men and women. It doesn't matter in the way that you should look at one. The weaker partner, and as heirs with you of the gracious gift of life, so that nothing will hinder your prayers. I promise you, that was revolutionary stuff being said in that culture then. Because what that is saying, and what they would have read that as is, wow, we're supposed to treat women the same, right? That culturally, that was not the way things were viewed. Women were not the same as men. They were not equal as men. And so what Peter is doing, he's using things, and he uses language that today we kind of go, oh, submit? What? I'm supposed to be less than? No, that's not what he's talking about, right? He's actually talking about, as a woman in that setting, you find yourself in a very unjust circumstances. You are not treated fairly. And so you are going to have to choose, how are you going to live in response to that, right? And you need to choose to live a godly life, even though you're in an ungodly situation, right? So, man, I could go on forever here. But it's really interesting, because if we step back and we get away from all the little things and say, oh, is this condoning slavery? Oh, is this condoning sexism? Oh, is a woman supposed to be subservient to her husband? All of that takes us away from what this is trying to teach us, right? And what this is ultimately trying to teach us is that your circumstances do not dictate your actions or your perspective, right? That's ultimately what it is saying. And here's the wonderful lie that has been perpetrated by a secular society. Secular society ultimately says that your circumstances dictate both your actions and the way you look at the world. That is a horrible, miserable way to live. and it will lead you to living an angry life, a frustrated life. You will never find joy. You will never find peace. You will never find happiness if you allow your circumstances to dictate your actions and your mindset. You will be miserable. I promise you. Right? Even in unjust situations. And that's hard because when we find ourselves in unjust situations, our emotional response is to fight against that right then and there. Right? And we need to understand that, you know what, sometimes we still need, we need to act godly. We need to choose to act in a good way in the face of injustice. And that may mean that we face a lot of persecution and a lot of criticism. It's funny. There was a study recently by the people at Harvard, and they came to a conclusion, right? An amazing conclusion that your mind is a really powerful thing. That the way you think about circumstances is really powerful. And they've started talking about mindfulness. And one of the things that they found is that if you go into things with a good attitude, even knowing that the circumstances are going to be bad, like if you go into it and say, you know what, I'm going to choose to see the good in this, that it'll actually start changing your reality. Reality actually can be changed because of your mindset. Oh, it only took them 2,000 years after Jesus said the same thing. Right? It is so ridiculous. In the church, we have relegated Christianity to being just about being saved. Christianity, that's part of it, but it's about freeing you up to live in an unjust world. And we haven't taught that, and we don't think about it. And now when we try to, people go, oh, is that condoning slavery? No. It's telling you how do you live in an unjust, unfair world. That you be better. That you live differently. Even though it's not fair. Right? And that is one of the things that as Christians we have to start doing. We can no longer allow our circumstances to dictate our actions or our mindset. We've got to start looking at things differently. That's what Peter is saying. He's saying, you're in bad situations. But you know what? You can rise above them. You can take control of your situations. I love how he's talking about slavery, and he has just talked about how live as free people. Right? Just because you're in slavery in a system doesn't mean you're not free. You are free. You have every opportunity to control the way that you respond and the way that you think about things. It is so important. And you know what? That's why the world was transformed. That's why the Roman Empire went from being completely secular to all of a sudden being predominantly Christian. And there were problems with that too. I understand. But it completely flipped a whole empire. Did it happen overnight? No, it actually took hundreds of years. But guess what? We're in no time crunch. Just start working to be better. Don't let your circumstances dictate your actions and your mindset, and choose to live the way God has called us to live, no matter what. That's what we do day in and day out. That's how we live in a secular world. And when we do that, we open up the opportunity for people to see who God really is. That's what our role is. Don't let your circumstances dictate and control you. You control your circumstances.